Well, Matthew, I hope you have been well. What have you been up to? What have you been thinking about? We here it is just finished engagement season, so everyone's coming in for tour, which is very good. And we've been doing that. We did have a session. You know, this time of year, it's kind of a tradition that all the children get sick. You know, that's part of winter where it goes through a few times, and eventually the children learn. Wait a minute, if I'm sick, I can lay on the couch and just everything happens for me. So then Reed was like, I don't feel good. I'm like, Reed, you're not sick. I can't move. Bring me candy. No, that's not how this works. But we did that. That was good. I've been thinking a lot on questions, just kind of going through the birth of sociology, which is pretty interesting. That even that word didn't exist till the 1830s. It seems to have started with Comte, C-O-M-T-E. It's debated, but like there's no idea of even sociology until the 1830s, which then really is interesting because then when you're reading like a Marx or you're reading a Tocqueville or like, you know, an Adam Smith, these people are all dealing with like sociology, but they don't have that language. And so you're kind of going around trying to articulate something that really is not even a mode of thinking at that point. And they, you know, they may have called it political economy, but really by political economy, they kind of mean sociology. Now, sociology today means something very different. It tends to mean a lot with power and structures of norms and so on and so forth. But like when you look at someone like a Marx or a Tocqueville, there's this idea that when we have ideas of how we can interact with people, say in terms of commodities, it's not where commodities or exchange is just something you add to your daily practices. If you add it to your daily practices, it transforms the entire way you engage with the world. Like if I hand you a camera, this is the Heideggerian point, then it's not the case that I just add a camera to your life and nothing changes. It transforms almost like with bread, you know, adding a little bit changes the whole composition because now everything is a potential photograph. You know, not beforehand, you know, your towardness, everything can have the technological essence, right? And so a lot of these classical thinkers in political economy, ergo, I think is very similar to sociology, are kind of like, wow, the very context that people are in the world transforms how they are toward one another in terms of social relations, in terms of trees become potential photographs. You know, we don't just as human beings add, you know, things are not really additional in a sense of it's not like 1, 2, now add 3. Okay, now 1, 2, 3. Like we sometimes talk about human beings as if we collect things in terms of a list. Like, oh, we just add them to our list. Oh, let's just add the camera to our list. Let's just add economics to our list. Let's just add modernity to our list. No, whatever you add to your list works backwards and changes everything that came before it and everything that comes after it. It has this interpenetrating, to use that fancy term, way about it where it changes how everything operates. And it's just very interesting because I think sometimes as human beings, we can go through life just thinking, oh, I'm going to add something to my life, yet not realizing that whatever we add changes the meaning of everything in our life. Like you can't just, for example, add a cell phone to your life and it not affect everything else in your life. Everything we add changes everything else. And I know you were talking in the email about faith and trust and different things. And it's interesting because there's something about faith where faith is not just something you add to your list of things you do. If you add faith to your list, it transforms the horizon of everything on your list. That is your life. It has this impact of changing the quality of everything about it. And it's just very interesting because there's something about faith that seems like what sociology is getting at. There's kind of this awareness that there are some ways that we structure our lives that then transform the entire meaning of it. So I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about how to keep pipes from freezing, et cetera, so forth. So it's always a pleasure to speak with you, Matthew. I appreciate you making the time.
Oh, I appreciate you hosting the forum. This is it's a treat for me to get to talk to you and hear from you. You stimulate my interests, among other things. So I would begin in response to say, the drop that changes the ocean into something that might be a recognizable ocean, or it might be something entirely different due to the drop. Well, there's a tendency then to want to catch the drop midway down and put it underneath a nice plate of glass, and to put that plate of glass underneath some choreographed scopes of glass to see exactly what's inside that drop, to change everything it would touch. Except, of course, my eye, which has the pretension of neutral observation to the phenomenon. So our pretensions here play a part in the changing, because I can devise a hypothetical where a person says, you know what? It's a naive view to say 9 o'clock in the morning, I make coffee, 10 o'clock in the morning, I have faith, 11 o'clock, I scramble the egg, and 11:30, 11:45, I wheel the car around the corner to work. If that is naive, still, I would say naive is to say, well, 9 o'clock in the morning, I wake up and make coffee. 10 o'clock, I have faith, but that faith changes the nature of what I remember that coffee being. In other words, I'm going to be grateful for that cup of coffee I had because of the faith I am now practicing at 10 o'clock, which will then allow me to not honk my horn at the person who turned in front of me as I round the corner to work at 11:45. That still seems naive to me because, why? I don't know. Because it treats faith as another, and this is a Heideggerian point that I would like to hear your response to, similar to the, how shall I say? It seems to drop the item of faith in between two other items so that you can see these three items equally. They're all beings in the world, are they not? Faith, coffee cup, turn around the corner. They're all equally hyphenated next to each other, are they not? Coffee cup, faith, turn around the corner, in the world, being. I mean, it's so arrow-like, where everything has changed and so everything stayed exactly the same. But I have this additional pretension of doing it all in faith that I can readily give an account for in words. I can say, well, I am this or that. But has anything changed? And so I think we want to bring in this idea of pretension.
Wonderful. I really like that phrase, the drop that changes the ocean, and the idea that your eye doesn't change. And it's also interesting because there's also a tendency to let me catch the drop and examine it in all possible ways before I drop it in the ocean, as if you can know what the drop will lead to before it drops into the ocean. Because that's also part of the problem, where if you don't have the faith, like there's something about the faith that is the willingness to let the drop hit the ocean, change the whole before you know how it's going to change the whole. And there's something about that participatory willingness, because you always kind of, in a faith mindset, realize, well, I can't examine the eye that's examining, like that great example. And so my eye is always going to, whatever it examines and concludes about the drop, is going to already be from a place of kind of a holding back. And there is something about the willingness to just let the drop hit the ocean that brings up the $1 million question that, to me, I always come back to, which is the distinction between wisdom and fear. Like, when are you being wise to stop the drop? When are you being fearful to not let it hit the ground? And that's where it seems to be this ability to sort of go through your day in a way of not thinking about sequences, but almost there's a lot of, am I going through my day in a way to train me to be able to discern the differences between fear and wisdom? Because there is something about a training or art mindset where you don't think of life so much as in sequence, but almost, I want to say, building. And there seems to be a difference between sequence and building. Like, faith needs to be the thing that organizes the way you carry yourself through time to make it build upon one another in terms of cultivating your art and ability to make discernment, say, between faith and wisdom. But often we actually go through time sequentially. And we might do this thing of, oh, okay, I had faith at 10, so now I'll be grateful for the coffee. But the issue is that means when you were having the coffee, you were not experiencing in time in a manner to have the next moment build upon it. You're just retrospectively interpreting the past versus at 9 o'clock, knowing you have faith. So then being about the business of having coffee at 9 o'clock so that it could then be built upon by the acts of faith at 10 and the going to work. So there's something about thinking about the day as a perpetual training ground, a perpetual kind of development or incubation of an art to be able to like discern those differences between fear and wisdom. Because there's one way of letting the drop of poison into the milk destroys it. And there's another way of, no, I need to let the drop of Christ's blood into the ocean of my life to transform the quality of it, right? Well, how do you tell the difference between, say, the blood of the lamb and, say, a drop of poison, right? Because the world will tend to say, no, that's poison when it's the blood of the lamb, and then vice versa, right? So there's this constant sort of way of it going about your day, thinking about it in terms of, am I having the moments that I'm going through really ultimately just be in service of some kind of sequence, even if I'm retrospectively reinterpreting what came before, but you're still in a kind of sequential time, as opposed to something that's building. One could think about Bergson's duration, this unfolding of something that's more like art, and then faith, as opposed to something. Faith has to kind of transform that entire experience of the unfolding of art, of time as an art. If it's merely something that makes you reinterpret sequential time, well, then the form of sequential time is still present, right? The presence of faith should actually transform the formulation of time into something that's going to look more like duration. But that's then where faith, as opposed to, well, that's then it's changing the form, not just changing the interpretation. So you could even talk, and I'll give it back to you. We talked about Leibniz with situation versus algebra. Faith is supposed to transform algebra to geometry, if you will. It's supposed to transform situation into an unfolding of a duration or something more like time, which then begs the question of how are you participating in that unfolding to get better at the art of life so that you can discern things, such as when you should let the drop hit the ocean or when should you not. Because if you are not living your day in a manner to be such a training ground, when the question is thrown upon you of if you should let the water hit the ocean or not, you're not going to be able to discern that. You're just ultimately going to be guessing.
Discernment is useless in the past tense. Discernment is useless in the future tense. Discernment is one of those weird pieces of knowledge that only fits right now. And yet, the acquiring of discernment is difficult to prescribe, because if it takes time to acquire discernment, then will I ever, this leads to a paradox, will I ever have discernment in time? If I needed discernment for and the thing about discernment is, it never is universally quantifiable. I'm coming to Bergson. It always is a specific case of judgment that will not be of the moment and pertain in any other time, by virtue of the fact that discernment is discerning what is necessary now for me or the person in question at some place, under circumstances that make this judgment call a question of moment. And yet there is this category or concept we refer to when we say discernment. And we distribute this concept across the arts. The discernment of a pilot. The crosswinds are some number, my machine says. Do I try to land? Do I go around? Do I have enough fuel? The discernment of a painter. Is it worth moving this brush now, given the clump of paint on it? Well, my technique says I need to make it flow, and the paint's still wet on the canvas, and if I wash this brush, I will betray the technique because it's drying, and I'm not going to get that sense of flowing in the sunlight of nature that I'm impressionistically going for. Well, whatever art you've distributed the concept of discernment to, the same question holds because it's still always a case of being specific. But if, and this is the assumption, discernment has to be trained, then will we ever get around to making discerned decisions or judgment calls at the right time? Or are we doomed in our preparation and in our practice to always make the calls of discernment late? And therefore, to the extent that we are capable, say, if only I would have known this then, I would have. And that be held up as the exemplar of discernment. A person who now knows what they could have done, had they known what they know now, to see what was really going on, quote unquote. Not to take into account the person who is naively, blissfully, perhaps unaware of the discernment that has to be made in order to go down the quote unquote right path. They just go through paths. And yet there also seems to be this gray middle where people can become pilots, people can become practitioners of a certain mode in painting or in sculpture, where even though they're, by their own testimony, not making many, if any, calls of discernment when it counts, they're still producing reliable, customary, getting through to most people, getting most people through the journey of bumping around items in the world. And so I come back around to this question of what matter does discernment have? Does it matter? In Hume's common life, does it matter to have discernment? Now, I want to say yes, but I don't seem to have a ready argument, or in Hume's terminology, cause that I can open the cupboard and point to and say, see, this is why discernment matters. And therefore, one ought to practice so as to be ready to discern when it is appropriate to discern. And I think by default, most of us accept money as the incentive substitute for the answer. Well, you should be a doctor because you'll make money. Or you should invest that sum in this project because you'll make money. Discernment's too tricky. But money, I mean, I know where the bank is.
No, that's excellent. So a few things come to mind. I love this question of, from where does discernment come? It's always something, all you have is the present. Discernment about the future is useless in the past, it's useless in the present. But in the present, when do you get the discernment? Where does it come from? If not from it's this very interesting question. And it makes me think of things like memory and Augustine, memory and sort of play, and this kind of idea that there's something about memory that seems to be necessary for the formulation of discernment, then the association of wisdom with age and so on and so forth. But then there's a weird thing of, well, where in age and sequence does the discernment come from? Why? And it also seems to be a big mistake to basically assume that an old person has wisdom. That doesn't seem to follow. And yet there is something about age that tends to somehow go with wisdom and discernment, because I think discernment and wisdom seem to have some sort of connection here. And there's something about discernment that seems distinction as well from, dare I say, identification. Whereas when I look at a laptop, I say, that's a laptop. Is that really discernment? You were mentioning in the email kind of on salt and saltiness and faith getting to something. There's something about faith and discernment that's very tied here that is deeper than identification. Like when I say that's an apple, it's not really discernment. Maybe when I'm a kid, well, maybe you could say when you're like really young and you don't really know an apple, then you've discerned the apple. So maybe there's something here about discernment has struggle with it. And it's something beyond the immediate experience that seems to just be identification. It does not seem that discernment is mere identification. Like, that's a blade of grass. Well, that means it's really weird then, because you are discerning something that isn't there and yet is there in its not there-ness. So right now we're talking about something that's starting to border perhaps on an apathetic, nothing there kind of thing. And it makes me think a little bit as well I was speaking with my friend Clayton, who I have to introduce you to because he's delightful, and he was talking about the apathetic walking stick. And what he meant by that is the apathetic, like when we think about the apathetic, it's not something we relate to by sight, but it's more like a walking stick. And the point he made is, how do you figure out where to go with a walking stick? By figuring out what's not in front of you. You progress when you say, oh, there's nothing here, now I can walk. So I really like this because the idea is that eyes are more capathetic, they're more present, whereas a walking stick is, I know how to progress because I know when something's not in the way. And there's almost something here where discernment feels like it's more of a learning to work by a walking stick, which is from figuring out what's not in the way of what's there. This is what's weird. It's like everything contains within it something that's there and yet not there at the same time, and you're trying to get to that. But that's not something you get with mere sight, but some sort of walking stick. And a walking stick is also interesting because that's kind of like a trial and error thing. I think I can go here, but no, I can't go here. I think I can go here, but I can't go here. And it's almost like what discernment comes from, because it's never in the present, and yet it somehow has to be in the present. It is like the emergent result of bumping into things that are in the way of progress until you find the progress, like the bumping of a walking stick. It's almost like discernment arises from years of bumping around, finding a way that's more apathetic beyond the immediate identification that can only be found by determining what isn't discernment, almost. It's this weird thing where, as with a walking stick, you figure out where you can go by figuring out where there's not something in the way. It seems like you figure out where is discernment by figuring out where discernment isn't, ergo identification is in the way. Oh, bumping up on identification without discernment. Oh, bumping up, bumping up, bumping up. Oh, let's go this way. And you start discerning it, like according to a walking stick. And it's almost like the reason, and I'll give it back to you, the reason why it may have some sort of association with age, but not guaranteed by age, is because progress by a walking stick has to be more trial and error through time, working it out. Whereas when I see something, it's kind of weird. You don't really see by sequence. It's just bookcase. It's just immediate. There's a much more kind of bamness to it. But that means identification is more immediate, whereas discernment requires more time. But this is the interesting fact with that then. That would suggest that discernment is a result of sequence, precisely because you need to go through sequence to determine the difference between sequence and duration. Like, you have to go through sequence to know that duration is not sequence. You have to experience that, which then, of course, makes it seem like it's sequence, but it's not, in the same way that it seems like identification is discernment, but it is not.
So this is where the subjective turn comes in to relieve us from the linguistic turn. I'll put the linguistic turn on the side of the sequence. And to my mind, ironically or not, faith shows up as a hand on the guardrail in sequence and not in duration. But it shows up in sequence, possibly, for us to lever over, to parkour over into duration, if we will. If we are not afraid. If we count it as wisdom before we know it as wisdom, or perhaps more to the point, not caring if it is wisdom. Faith seems to not care what wisdom is by definition. That is to say, it deliberates. And deliberation, one I think could argue, is expressed in sequence. this, that, well, here are the arguments for, here are the arguments against. I'm listing, I'm sequencing. I want to go from pro to con, from con to pro, and then arrive at a decision, which I assume is reasonable given my beginning and given every step between. I should be able to share this reasoning with others. And not only should this argument be valid, because I've shown you my steps in sequence, but I am claiming it is sound because it's taken me where I wanted to go. And I suppose the end is good and conforms to the beginning. All those things, whether it's sound and valid or whether it's just valid and not sound argument, still doesn't answer what the good is and all these other subjective things. But they can be put under the microscope of linguistics. So the linguistic turn, I want to put in the consequence. It can be studied. You can plop an institution on that sequence and fill the windows with busy people looking at the grammar of this, the grammar of that, my participle here, you keep your preposition over there, and they're Legoing this thing. It's important work, and I believe it is. Duration, though, that to me is the subjective term. And I don't want to play these off as one is better than the other, because faith is not that sort of thing. You have time to prepare for, because faith doesn't say, if it is genuine faith, I would say, on a day, there will be an unlocked door. Normally it's locked. It's door number 72. Now you're going to walk down this hallway for the next 3 months and the door will be locked. Try it yourself. Okay. But on March 25th at 11 o'clock, I know you round the corner to go to work, but I want you to drink your coffee a little faster at 9, because you're going to run up that staircase and you're going to go to door number 72 and it will be unlocked for this window of time. That to me doesn't seem to be faith in any other sense than the linguistic term, because they're providing you a sequence. They're saying it's valid. And all that's left is for you to walk the steps. In this case, run from your normal routine. So it feels like, wow, I am changing things, right? I'm breaking my routine. I'm going faster through the sequence than normal. Whoa, it's asking a lot of me, this faith. Wow, can't wait to get there. But where does duration come in? And it's hard to talk about this duration because it comes back to the question of discretion, not discretion, discernment, as we said. One last thing, and then I hand the baton to you. I think we already find ourselves in a Hegelian logic, the way we've been talking so far. Hegel might come in and say, well, you two, congratulations, you have presupposed the definition of discernment. By incorporating the concept of discernment, you have not questioned yet in your talking about it. So already you're in discernment. You're pretending if you think you are. You're not outside the building of discernment, looking in saying, wonder what the best way to enter this building of discernment is. Should I go through the back door? Should I go through the front? Should I jump through the window? My friend and I, let's be philosophers and figure out a strategy to get at this discernment thing over there. Instead, he'd say, you're already in discernment. The question is, what floor do you want to go to next? Do you know where the elevator is? Do you know anything about the situation? I mean, just now it has dawned on you because you didn't know the Hegelian logic. It just now has dawned on us that we were in the building we thought we were outside of. Well, what more can we learn about discernment rather than asking, what is discernment? I think that is one of the Hegelian moves, is to say, not the Socratic question, what is virtue? What is goodness? What is truth? But rather, what is more truth than I know now? What is more? Because I already am in. Now, whether or not one agrees with that. But I think we already are implicitly assuming it, or at least I will rehearse that move of Hegel, that we already have presupposed a definition of discernment, and whether or not we want to relieve ourselves of the burden of that assumption is up to us. But I want to keep the sequence that you've said, and I do want to put it opposite to duration so far.
Excellent. On the example that you were saying of running up the staircase, I very much like that, because I think a lot of times people conflate faith and basically magic or superstition. And basically you could say that what you're getting, the problem is some people define faith in terms of doing the right sequence. But the problem is you're not dwelling in a different creation, or ultimately there's no dwelling there. And it would seem as if faith has some sort of ability to dwell differently. And I think also on this kind of idea of the balancing beam, the guardrail or something, there's something about duration is a guardrail you're holding to kind of keep your balance as you work through sequence, to not then think according to just sequence. It's almost like you need to hold on to duration precisely so you don't fall into the mistake of treating faith as a magic trick or a certain sequence, that it's a dwelling in the holding, I suppose, of duration, and you're dwelling in that relationship to something that cannot be reduced to sequence, but can only be held on to from sequence. And that then suggests that it's something like swimming, which you can only learn to swim. This seems to be the issue with discernment. You can only learn to swim in the water. You can't, from propositional knowledge, learn how to swim. You can be told different things, but you have to jump in. Well, this is a weird thing. How do you jump into duration? What is the sequence or the activities? It doesn't seem like it could be a sequence by definition that makes you jump in. And I think some of perhaps the impulse of magic is the notion that if we only found up the right sequence of words, of ritual, of whatever, then we're going to enter into dwelling. And that doesn't seem correct. Dwelling seems to be some sort of not believing that you have to find the right sequence, but that you have to change the way that you are towards sequence, or that you believe that there's something in sequence. Like, I'm always taken by, and the problem of discernment seems really tied to this, which then is kind of the problem of judgment and the problem of wisdom. And what is so interesting about all of those is that they're always so hard to define or talk about. Like, and there's something there in their difficulty, because it seems like it's hard to say what exactly is beautiful. You can do it, but it seems really hard. So is the goodness and truth. And there's something about wisdom and discernment which seem tied together, that it's almost as if they are the subjective version of the infinites. Like, they are the things that open to the infinites. The three infinites are the connections with it, and thus they themselves have this difficulty to define, precisely because they are that of which is moving beyond a finite definition. And it's interesting where for Kant, you know, the key move in the critique of judgment that gives us reason to think judgment is valid and not merely on this side of the noumenon is ultimately the sublime, beautiful.
Well said.
And it's like, you see the beautiful and bam, you know it's beautiful. Oh, well, then there's reason to believe that you're actually capable of discernment. But how did you know it? Because you just knew it. Wow, you're capable of some sort of zero knowledge proof. You know, in computer science, they talk about like the zero knowledge proof, right? Where you're able to see something and know it's true even without proof. Like, I think like zero proof, like zero knowledge proof or something. And so likewise, there's something about beauty where when you see it and apprehend it, it's kind of like a zero knowledge proof that you know that's beautiful. Oh, and you know that your judgment is right. Oh, well, then you know that there's something about judgment that is not mere calculation. It's this immediate grasping of something else. And it's like, bam, you've grasped duration now. Because duration is almost like the fact that there are moments of which come forth that cannot be found just because you time the sequence. Like beauty, beauty almost always has to be a rupture. Like, that's another kind of key characteristic of beauty. Is like, if you plan it, if you calculate it, it might be pretty, but it's not going to like strike you, right? And it's almost like duration, when you're holding on to the guardrail of duration, it's where you know that you have to carry yourself in a certain way through life to increase the probability of those moments of beauty, of your ability to apprehend them, of your ability to be changed by them. None of this, though, which is reducible to a guaranteed sequence. I cannot give you the sequence you need to do to experience beauty. I cannot give you the sequence you need to do to get better at beauty, but there's a way to hold yourself in life, holding on to that guardrail like the walking stick, where you're finding it through blindness, and yet you're finding a way that does actually make you dwell in duration while in sequence, but not just sequence. And it's as if it's like the revelation of the distinctions between duration and sequence has to have this character of the wind comes and goes. It happens. Once it happens, then you can know it can happen. And now you've seen a way. Okay, well, let me feel around to kind of figure that out. And it makes me think, and then I'll give it back to you. Sequence seems to be step 1, step 2, step 3. Okay, this is how you paint the painting. You do the paint here, then you do this paint. Okay. Duration seems to be a lot more about, like, you know, you have, and I've used this example before because I think it helps. Like, you have those examples of those big pictures made of small pictures, but you don't necessarily see it until you stand in the right place, and then you see the picture. Like Nabokov talks about finding the sailor, and then you say, oh, there it is. It's like those optical illusion things. What's so weird about those is I cannot give you a sequence you need to go on to see the big image. It just happens suddenly, right? That seems to be what duration is like. Like a better, you know, the example I've also used is the FedEx sign. You know how on the FedEx sign it has that arrow in it, the negative space arrow? I can't give people the sequence they need to do to see it. Like suddenly you just see it and you go, oh my gosh, there it is. But here's the trick. Once the FedEx arrow is the revelation that it's possible to look at something and not see what's there. Like it's possible to be looking at something to see but not see, right? That seems to be part of the revelation of duration, where you realize that you can be going through sequence and there's like a negative space arrow in the sign. There's a thing that's dwelling in the sequence you didn't see. And once you realize that's possible, your entire relation to sequence throughout the entirety of your life changes forever. Now you're holding on to the guardrail. Now you're holding on the duration because you know it's the possibility of things suddenly being there that are just there. And not because you knew the sequence, but because you knew you had to hold yourself in a life open to the possibility of things coming forth, like the FedEx arrow. And that seems to be getting at what discernment, how discernment defines itself from identification. Is that dwelling in the possibility that a thing you're looking at could have something more there, that there's something there that can come forth if you only continue to dwell in it, as opposed to just assume because you've identified it, you're done with it. Which then, and now I give it back to you, that seems to have something to do with faith. Like faith is the ability to look at the FedEx sign before you know there's an arrow in the sign and believe there is something more there. And even though you don't know the sequence, even though you don't know the steps you need to do to see that thing that you believe is there, you dwell in your relationship to the sign so it becomes possible to see the negative arrow, or it becomes possible to experience beauty. But that seems to be where you're holding on to the invisible guardrail to guide you in that presence.
I think one of the litmus tests or markers of the movement through duration versus the movement through sequence is, given the example you cited of the invisible FedEx arrow, a point I want to bring out. This seems to suggest that the example, qua example, is fine. Load them up. Put them in the back of the vehicle of discourse. Deliver on time these examples. But don't suppose there is a golden thread or invisible whatever posited that strings all these boxes of cases, of examples, of things that increase the probability of. Don't pretend there is some principle of sufficient reason going through all of them that must make them cohere with a meta-narrative. Now, I'm a Christian. So why would I say that? I think there is a difference between a meta-narrative as sequence and a cosmos as ordered whole by the King of the universe. I do not think those two things are the same thing. I think as a Christian, I would say the former Well, I shouldn't say as a Christian, I would say, because the proposition doesn't flow from me being a Christian. How about I say this? What I mean in the context of this conversation by meta-narrative is, to use your dichotomy of identification and
discernment.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't think we can escape identification, nor should I think we would want to. Because with an identifier, you have a name, and with a name, you have the umbrella protecting the instance from the rain of obscurity. And you want to protect your instances, because those are the things that are your garden, insofar as you have names for things around you to walk towards, the towards part. I'm coming to the stick, but if I suppose in addition to these things I can identify, I think if I suppose in addition to that, a narrative that ties them all together so seamlessly, I think I have something next to magic. I have the pretension of magic. Because what is magic if not, here's something you can identify. Here's something I can identify. It's called a cloth. Here's another thing you can identify. Whoa, where'd it go? And then here's another thing you can identify. It came back. Now, there might be more sophisticated ways of putting one identifier in front of another. But what you're doing is lining up a sequence of identifiers, cloth, thumb, and in an interval of time, you're making one of those identifiers disappear. But it's not really gone. So it's an abuse of that present absence possibility. It's saying, here's a thing identified, here's a second thing identified, here's a third thing identified, and the fourth thing that's identified, that was caused by all three. And all those three things lead up to this thing that I identify as distinct and different and more important than, and the result of, I'm adding all these adjectives to this fourth identified thing, making it seem that those first three identified things are different than they were when I was identifying them. So the magic bleeds into psychology. If the logos is cataloging the things we identify, A, B, C, and this is crucial, in an interval, something might be slipped in. A little hazy language, weasel word. I forgot the author who used that terminology of weasel words. Onomatopoeia, whatever they throw in to make language rub against itself. They're now disposing, I would say, the soul to react to what's revealed next as something distinct. And whoa, that's the magic. Wow, curiosity is aroused in me for this fourth thing identified. And I want to know more about it. And now I'm intrigued and I'm so interested. Kierkegaard would say, be careful when you're interested, because you're now parceling off a segment of existence and you're paying to it attention that something else has caused you to pay attention to it with. And the only thing that you're not paying attention to when you're hyper-focusing on this thing is what caused you to give so much attention to it. And then what if that elaborates itself and goes on for a long time? What sort of person is at the end of that story? And then you introduce how characters become fate in sequence. Okay. But then I like how you brought in Immanuel Kant and the sublime, because when you said that, I thought, okay, identifiable object 1, identifiable object 2, identifiable object 3, and then my interest is starting to be aroused. I'm starting to think, there's a pattern here. There's something I want to hold on to that isn't these three things. It's what I think is between them, right? It's that thread between them that must be there. There must be something holding together all my associations. There must be a sociology to this economy, right? There has to be. There must be this tissue of relevance, because I've been with it from 1, 2, and 3. I've been with it all the way. And if there is nothing there except those three things between them, then I wasn't there between them, right? So now I'm starting to identify with this tissue I've hypothesized, and I'm starting to give it life from me, and I'm starting through my interest. But the question is it even there? The magician has captured me somehow. Willingly or unwillingly, I've been captured. Some part of me has been hooked by the advertiser or whatever it is. This isn't just any cup of coffee. This is Folgers in your cup. I mean, this is not just an identifiable object here. There's a story behind this. There's a tissue of relevance here. And this is what I'm telling myself. This is key. It's a monologue I'm having with myself right underneath the surface. And the only thing that's giving that monologue strength is the interval of time allowed as I'm going through 1, 2, 3. Whatever pattern that is, my morning routine, it might be. All right. The moment something sublime happens, Kant would say, as he has said in the Critique of Judgment, one marker of it being genuine sublimity and not just a magic trick of the fourth identifiable thing being somehow shrouded in occult practices that take me for a ride, is I am disinterested at that moment. My interest that was aroused has just been stopped and thwarted, and it's of no relevance to what I'm experiencing. I didn't have to have all those sins for the love of Christ. Adam was created to be loved by God. And so someone would say, well, I needed to go through that sin. I need to sin more so God can love me. That is working on a pathology. Now, does sin happen? Of course. Confession is real. But that disinterested moment when we break out of our interests and still reality is there to greet us, I think is such a relief to know. To know that the other is real. The other is not the amassed consequence and agglomeration of all my interests, proclivities, and memories beforehand. And that, I think, flies in the face of technocratic surveillance, where data is harvested and brought back to us in the form of an algorithm that suggests where our interest should take us next. Oh, you like this book? I bet you would like the other book. Well, my interest is going from identifiable object 3 to identifiable book 4 with interest, not with disinterest. And this could go on for 50 years. And then character becomes fate.
Outstanding. And it made me think on if beauty is not the slave of sequence. Beauty can come in whenever it wants. You know, it has power like the lion. And it's interesting because grace is also not bound by sequence. How horrible would it be if it was? Like, grace can come in at any point. And that's precisely why there's always hope. Grace can always prevail because it is like beauty, that when grace comes in, when beauty comes in, you recognize it, precisely because you're disinterested. Like, it strikes you. You know this is beautiful, and you know it not because it is the result of interest you build upon, but it's just there. And that beauty, and it also makes me think. Like, there's this kind of idea where we're talking about sequence, you know, where a lot of the economists like Marx is talking about exchange and how we're bound by the logic of exchange. There's a way in which the logic of beauty is the opposite of exchange, because there's no exchange you can make to bring about beauty. There's no sequence you can bring to bring about beauty, grace. It's there, bam. Likewise, the moments when things are their fullest self, when salt is salt, when humans are humans, this just breaks through and you know it. Like once it occurs, oh, this is a conversation, then it breaks through. It just happens. There's a moment, like where they talk about with circling and dialogos, where a conversation suddenly becomes something else. There's something where sitting down and writing on your computer is no longer sitting down and writing on your computer. It's a flow state. There's a moment where the guys talking in the cipher suddenly becomes a cipher. There is a moment where a thing gets a different quality that you never can predict the sequence ahead of time. You can identify the conditions that increases the probability it occurs, but only if you're not calculating so crudely. That's always the weird thing. Like, you know that if I have a canvas and I have painting, like the probability of painting occurring is up, but then you almost have to leave. Like, and just wait for the day. Maybe you hold the paint for 20 years. Who knows? You know, having those things are part of what's necessary to paint, but you also know it's not sufficient to paint. There's some sort of breakthrough that has to occur, that then the things that are gathered in your environment can be brought together. And that realization that life has the possibility of this thing breaking through, that actually overcomes your interest in a way, it kind of eclipses your interest, suggests then the possibility of there being something, a kind of life that you can follow more apathetically, like duration, because this thing can break through. It can occur. What's interesting, I'm very interested by why you're talking about interest, because there's something about when you're talking about, oh, this is a really good metaphor. Like, then you're interested in the metaphor to the point where it does your thinking for you. And you're thinking, it's doing your thinking for you. Likewise, the problem with sequence is it does your thinking for you in a way, right? Like, oh, I just need to follow the sequence. The problem with exchange is it does your thinking for you. One of the funny things about beauty is it's as if you've never thought before, both in the, you've never thought this before, and wow, I was actually incapable of thinking until this kind of experience, because I was only able to think in terms of interest. Like, my thinking was guided by interest, not the beholding of something that interest actually in a way gets in the way of. Now, what's strange about this is why I also like kind of the apathetic walking stick, is because, like, when you're going through the Bible, okay, Jesus is the lamb. Okay, I hit that. All right, and he's a rose of, okay, I hit that one. Living water. And what you're doing is you're using the metaphors to determine where the path is between them. Mm-hmm. The problem is when we say, oh, I found the right metaphor with my stick. Now I'll stay here. It's as if you have to have, and one of the reasons, though, you do need to have good metaphor is because it matters what you hit with your stick, because it matters what path you go down, right? This is the weird balance. Like, you need interest in the sense that you need to have a kind of investment, so there's something there to hit with your stick, but you need the interest to leave it behind. In the same way that you need to hold something to drop, like, so that you then become the kind of person who can let something go. Like, never having something is not the same. Being a person who never had anything is not the same as being a person who let something go. Like, those are different. And what's interesting is that it's like you need interest to know the difference between interest and disinterest. Like, in order to have the letting go, you need good metaphors to know how metaphor structures thought, but so that you can leave the metaphor behind. And it's difficult metaphorically to get this when we think about sight, because you don't really leave behind what you see. The bookcase is there. It's not going anywhere. But when I have a walking stick, I'm leaving behind the things I hit. But I need them there to hit so that I know the way between them. And this is where it's so tricky, because there's this, oh, great, we're finding the good metaphor, and then you hold it, versus, oh, great, this is a good metaphor because I now know where to walk apathetically with my walking stick. So you're always in this gaining so that you can let go, seeing so that you can see beyond, having interest to get into a disinterest, going through sequence so that you can then find the duration. But that is this kind of letting. Thomas Wynne, we'll talk about that with Heidegger, this sort of letting versus controlling. You're using metaphor in order to undergo a kind of letting of yourself through the metaphor, letting it go as you use the walking stick. And yeah, we have to, and this gets into where you have to have identification, because you need to have something to hit with your walking stick. You need understanding in Hegel, but you have to use identification to get to discernment. You got to have sequence, but because you're in finite time, but you're using it to get to duration. Likewise, you got to have understanding, but you're getting to reason. You're moving from one-sidedness to more dialectical, both-sidedness. But here's the weird move in Hegel, and this is where I think, and then I'll give it back to you, where discernment comes out. If you move from understanding to reason, if you move from, we'll say, identification to discernment, okay, well, you can't identify discernment then without actually not being entirely in discernment. So in the act, so likewise, if you're understanding reason, then you're not actually doing the thing in its fullness. And yet you always have to have understanding to be in reason. So you have to somehow, so you somehow, to go back to the identification discernment, so you have to, while having identification always in play, move to discernment that you're not just identifying, but discerning about the discernment. What in the world? Well, that's where it seems to be something like this apophatic walking stick. Like, discernment is not something you identify in the same way that a walking stick never identifies. You don't identify a thing with a walking stick. You identify the way where there's nothing in the way. Now, maybe you're super talented with a walking stick and you can identify something with it because you're that good and you can tell by the sound. But most of the time, you're identifying with a walking stick without identifying too much. That's kind of like the move. Like, you're identifying there's something there, but you're not identifying with it. It's almost like that's the problem. Identification, once it becomes identifying with, you're identifying it to move beyond it. And that seems to be the act of discernment. Like, the act of, it has to be a kind of act where you're always moving. And that is definitely kind of Hegelian, because like, it has to be the action. It has to be the unfolding of the concept. And it's the concept that's unfolding into new terms that then has to understand what it just did according to those new terms. But then it changes the quality of the thing that it had because it's in new terms. So what is going on? Well, it's an unfolding of a mystery. I guess this is what it is. Like, discerning about discernment requires discerning that it is a mystery, that the moment you identify it, it's gone. But that's not because it's not there, but because it is the thing that has to be that way, because it is changing the quality of your life. And every single time you ask about it, you're then making stagnant that process or reducing it to sequence. So there's something unfolding about that, but I give it back to you.
And I think what keeps one from concluding from what you said at the end, it was said wonderfully and beautifully and succinctly, and the parts came together for me. But what might keep one from concluding that life is an illusion of life, tears are an illusion of tears, understanding is the illusion of understanding, and it all must collapse into a drain of starting from the beginning over and again and again and again and again, is the Christian worldview, where the cosmos as an ordered whole is accounted for as created by God, who is not the world, but is everywhere present in the world, energetically moving it, revivifying it, and ordering it, with the element of freedom on our side to have these discussions in the first place. And I do think it is crucial. A person can follow Hegel into an Eastern mysticism that leaps into the void and calls it bliss. But that's a nominal case. There is another way out of saying it all is an illusion while honoring that sequence of claims you made. Even finding duration in it. And I think one way to make that concrete is to bring up pattern, perhaps, in the Christian tradition, specifically in the Bible. I want to make 3 moves in 3 distinct places. Book of Genesis, Leviticus, and then in the gospel, I think the Gospel of Luke. Ends with a leper. And the leper ends with gratitude. And gratitude, I think, here is important because it is an instance of the sublime, where you would expect interest, but there is none. All right, but before I go there, in Genesis, I think we have something similar held up to us as a dichotomy that would map onto identification and discernment. But before I say what that is, I think we should step back and see that we've made concentric circles. The outer circle is the sequence. We all find ourselves in a sequence because we have this thing called time that we move through. The walking stick is a very small interval of time back and forth. You could call it trial and error. Some people are more conscientious with their walking stick than others. Long time is I'm going to go to med school and I'll come out in 8 years. I'll be a doctor. That's a different kind of stick. It's a very long arc before it comes back to itself. And it might bobble and weave and not come back. Person might quit med school, whatever. Longer intervals. Character is fate, perhaps. These things. But that's a sequence. Inside that, we have discernment. We find ourselves presupposing discernment as we talk about discernment. We're inside the building, not outside the building. And then inside that is interest. So we're already in interest as we discuss interest, already in discernment as we discuss interest, discuss discernment. And of course, we are in a sequence because here we are talking in an orderly fashion, giving each other turns. We both turned on the laptop to see each other's face. We both are, in this friendship, a product of our past meetings. Mm-hmm. And also, the words we're exchanging with some understanding is the product of the people we've read. All right. What we're trying to do is go to the bottom of that without losing ourselves in an illusion of blah, blah, blah. Okay. In the book of Genesis, I was thinking about this the last 2 days. There seems to be a pattern of God said, and there was. I mean, that's in the text. God said, let there be, and there was. Let there be, and there was. Let there be, and there was. Light, water, mound of earth, and there was, blah, blah, blah. Animals, blah, blah, blah. Authority and indication. 2 different moods. God said, let there be, the imperative mood. And there was, the indicative mood. Let's hold that, because that is the formula. That is the outline through which Moses talked about ex nihilo, things coming into being. Now we go to Leviticus, and I look at the priest, and the priest, among the other things, the priest is charged with receiving a leper, for instance, but not any leper, a leper who says, I have been cleansed. I am no longer a leper. See? And what's the priest's job at that moment? To see there was a cleansing. Then the priest says he is clean. He must be reintroduced to society. You see that reversal? Mm. God said, let there be, and there was. Imperative, indication. But when the leper comes, he says, look, there was healing. It's gone. And the priest says, you are clean. You shall go back into society. This man is cleansed. All right. Mm-hmm. Authority was in the beginning, and then indication. In the case of priestly cleansing and ritual rites and naming a reality, it's indication, then authority from the human priest, the stand-in son of Levi, tribe of Levi, the Levites. Okay, so we have this interesting, one, identification of a pattern, 2, identification of pattern. Ooh, my interest is aroused. What's going to be the 3rd, right? I'm already in trouble as a thinker. Already I'm in trouble. I've dug myself a hole and I can't get out. But I come to the gospel. And the gospel does what the gospel does. In our language that we're discussing, it brings duration to relieve us of sequence without destroying sequence, because creation is good.
Right.
And this is the Christian alternative to having to destroy our enemies. We should pray for our enemies. Okay. Jesus is going into a village, and 10 lepers outside the village, at a distance, cry out to him, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. He says to them at a distance, go show yourselves to the priests. Now, here's the thing. Here's a blank space that a person could paint in. They're walking. There's an interval of time. This is where the problem of identified thing one, identified two, and now my interest is aroused. Who knows? I might just end up at the priest's door. Well, that's perfectly fine. This is law. This is custom. There's nothing wrong with that. They're going. And they're healed. Wait a minute. Hypothetical case. They start talking to each other. Wait a minute. I'm supposed to be cleansed and then I go to the priest. But we were all full of leprosy and he said, go to the priest. That's backwards. I'm supposed to be cleansed and then I indicate my cleansing so that the priest can, through his authority, deem me available to society again. A different kind of cleansing, but it's the same thing. Rather, it's a way of talking about this interplay of authority and indication, the two moods. But why? But he told us, go show ourselves, but we're full of leprosy. We're not supposed to do that. We're asking to be cleansed, but he says, go show yourselves to the priest. Why doesn't he just cleanse us and then say, go show yourselves to the priest? You see the conundrum? On the way, they're cleansed. Okay. Whoa. You know what? All my footsteps got me here. And they got me cleansed because I'm following the law. I asked the man Jesus to cleanse me, and he basically said, follow the law. And I followed the law. I made the steps, and look, I'm cleansed. This is great. I'm going to keep going. But does the law save man? St. Paul said it's meant for murderers, blah, 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 idolaters, blah, 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 blah. But here now they're compiling through their interest, they're compiling law after law after law. See, if only we have enough commentators, only if we have enough this, that, and the other thing, if we really understand the depths of this particular word over there, then we have this whole vision of exactly, yes, I'm cleansed. I might as well show up to the priest because that's exactly what the law says. I'm going back into society. This is great. This is exactly how it's supposed to work. One of those lepers turned around, cried out in joy, came back to Jesus, bowed his face to the ground, and showed thanksgiving. And Jesus said, were there not 9 others? Were not 9 cleansed? Were not 9 others cleansed? And here I have, was there no one found to give thanks to God except this foreigner? Then he said to him, arise, go your way. Your faith has made you well. All right. What I'm concerned with is that turn from what would have been a sequence. Well, let's finish the law. He said, go show yourself to the priest. This is what you do when you're cleansed. I need to finish it. And there's nothing wrong with finishing it. But it's backwards from the beginning. I'm not supposed to show myself. I'm not even supposed to have the intention to show myself. I'm not supposed to begin this sequence of indicating with my indications until I'm cleansed. But he says, go show your indication before it's indicative. But now as I'm doing it, I'm being healed. But this guy's going to turn around and, as it were, in duration, put everything on pause. Yeah, the law will be there. The priest will be, I know his address. He'll be there. It'll all be there. A coffee cup at 9 in the morning, it'll be there. I'm going to put everything, as it were, on pause and in duration walk to the second person of the Trinity and give thanks and almost perform another kind of death. It's not a death. It's not death. It's called humility. He put his face all the way to the ground with thanksgiving. You see how it's not death. It's humility. Before they were at a distance. Now he's so close. He's so close. He's talking to him. And he's giving thanks. Oh, that was in duration. And it wasn't called for in the law. And it wasn't called for in the command even. But it's being indicated now. In that new indication of gratitude and thanksgiving is being indicated not to the priest, but to the priest of priests in this time, which is not the sequence that the law permitted, but is somehow born out of that sequence in the law and has found this extra space, not destroying one jot or tittle of the law until all was accomplished. You see, this interplay of not forgetting how the universe was made and kept together, even in such a stark case as the case of a leper being reintroduced to society. So in closing that point, I think it's so important to see examples as examples and not as pearls on a string of a meta-narrative. Because the case method in law, I think, is wonderful. It allows you to beep, 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 walking stick, boom, bounce off other things as you try to find your way to the next point, because you know, as you're making your way from point to point in an argument, you have to give room to others in society, i.e. your neighbor. That is what law is. It's always making space for the widow and the orphan, always making space for the merchant, always making space for the foreigner, always making space for the father and the child, always making space.
That was magnificent. That was wonderful. Without sequence, there's no possibility of these moments of breaking the sequence in terms of duration. And it's fascinating too to think that in the leopard going back to Jesus, it's also saying my allegiances are with Christ, not with the law and the sort of Jewish society, like, my allegiances is here. And that notion as well of, in creation, God, God said, let there be, and there was, let there be, and there was, and so Jesus like, let there be, go see the priest, and it was, they were healed. And then as well, it's like you're saying, it's like, well, then I'm supposed to go see the priest and I'll be, put back in society. But you had one leopard that knew when to break the sequence. And it's almost as if discernment is the ability to know when to break the sequence, because time has come anew, like duration is breaking through, grace is coming through. And it makes me think as well, like we talked last time, you need natural law precisely so you can recognize surprise. Like if you don't have consistency, surprise doesn't come forth. You can't recognize surprises meaningfully. And surprise is like highest reality. Like the point of consistency is for the surprise to break through. Likewise, the point of sequence is so duration can break through, but you have to know when it's breaking through. You have to recognize that. And the one leper did. It's like duration has broke through. I need to go, I need to go be thankful for it. And then I'll go about the sequence. But that little break in the sequence then changes the quality of the whole sequence. Now the law is there to make grace meaningful. Natural law is there, so the surprise is meaningful. So the point of sequence is to make the meaningful of duration. And it's almost like on this question of what is discernment, if discernment has, well, to know when to break the sequence, likewise with the stick, is to know where to walk by what's not there. Okay, sequence here, I need the sequence there to hit with my stick to know where to go forward. So I'm not just following the sequence, I'm breaking through. There's something about knowing that something has just happened that means I need to break the sequence. And actually, that's quite difficult because when people have their routines, like life can show, like the surprise, the grace, the miracle, the beauty, these things happen, but very often people miss them because they're actually too married to their sequence. They're like, oh, I'm busy, I have to continue with my sequence. Oh, I can't do that today, I have to continue with my sequence. Or, oh, I can't actually cultivate perhaps what is needed to experience beauty because I'm not getting paid for that, and that's not part of my sequence, nor is it validated as a sequence that is worth doing. And so there's almost like idolatry is the holding to sequence at the expense of duration. as opposed to using sequence, like using images or using art to point to the mystery that's always beyond it. And it's almost like that is what we have to do. We have to hold things with that open hand. Like, this is not idolatry. In fact, this is proper. This is idolatry, and this is hopelessness. So there's likewise something about, because the other thing, like you talked about discerning and concluding, and there's something interesting where interest concludes, where discernment is the ability to keep a journey going without concluding, which therefore makes it in the image and likeness of the mystery, ergo God, that's infinite. There's something about discernment that is the ability to progress, avoiding conclusion in a way, conclusion as in a finishing, because if it finishes, well, it's not mystery then, because mystery is an ever deepening progress. But this is what's very strange, is because what does it mean to think not trying to conclude anything? That seems to be the opposite of thinking. Thinking is about reaching conclusions, right? Well, actually, thinking is about reaching conclusions about how to stop concluding, in a way, in the same way that interest is about finding things that you can leave behind. And there's something here now where the act of discernment is the act of thinking that is a kind of art form of how to continue progressing, to continue transforming, continue developing maybe, without ever concluding. Because if you conclude, you're no longer in the image and likeness of mystery, or God, or the infinite, or the dance, because they have a certain infinite quality to them, but it's not spurious. It's not a spurious infinity. It's not the infinity of a list. It's the infinity of a dance, like the true infinity that Hegel talks about. That's more of like the new capitulation of the relations that are there according to new qualities. So is there something about, and then I'll give it back to you, and everything you said on the exegete, that was remarkable. Is there something about discernment, which is the ability to tell thinking that is seeking a conclusion versus thinking that is trying to dwell in the mystery, and you begin to identify the difference between that kind of thinking? Because, that feeling of interest, yeah, you're exactly right. There's a real danger of this. It's similar to the danger of basically owning things. Is it bad to own things? No, but there's a point where owning becomes hoarding, right? And now we're in danger. And I was speaking to Michelle about this all the time. It's actually really difficult to determine if you should throw something away, because you can always come up with reasons for why you might need it one day. Like, hoarding is remarkably rational. Like, when you see it on the Discovery Channel, it's like, oh, that's crazy. But it's actually, for me, very easy to see how that happens, because you can always imagine you may need it. You can always come up with a sequence where if you don't have this, you're going to fail the sequence. So you're like, I need this in case the weather is X, Y, or Z, or something breaks and blah, blah, blah. And so the moment you own, you're at risk of entering the hoarding because of the difficulty of finding a reason to let it go. Likewise, the moment you have an interest, you're in danger, because when do you stop the interest? You could always follow it more and more and more. Now you're in a Thomas Pynchon novel, right? Now you're in an endless maze or something like that. And yet the interest also is part of almost the beginning development of discernment. It's almost like it starts there because it has to go through having an interest that you let go, because you learn, no, that's not actually discernment. That's kind of a low resolution of it that you have to go through. It's like Paul talking about milk going to solid foods as you're going on. So there's some sort of movement to solid food in discernment that has some sort of character of journeying without concluding. Journey, like thinking without reaching conclusions, but instead keeping you moving in the sequence so that the surprise is possible. Maybe that's a part of it, and I'll give it back to you, because it's like maybe discernment is the knowing that you have to move through sequence to have the breakthroughs of duration. You have to move through consistency to have the surprise, but then the discernment always keeps in mind that it can't predict that breakthrough, because the moment it does, it's actually now just in the realm of understanding and interest, and it's looking for a dopamine rush, as opposed to be in a state of disinterest eclipsed by something beyond itself. I'd be curious what you think.
Three thoughts. Saint Macarius the Great, I was reading his life the other day. He made baskets by hand and sold them to keep his hut in order, his small cell in order. And I think it's not by accident that what he made were baskets. And I will take some liberty in what I'm about to say as an allegory. His job was a handicraft, and it was a series of iterations. And each of those iterations was an instance of a container.
Mm.
And none of those containers did he keep. So what does that tell me? It tells me a number of things. It tells me that what we do contains we know not what. It's a basket. And I can keep the basket and fill it with what I think that basket should have. That's my interest. It's not going to hold everything, so I might need another basket. And then I'll keep that basket, and I'll keep the third, and I'll keep the fourth, and I have all these baskets. I need a bigger basket. Now I'm starting to sound like that man who said, you know what, I have all this stuff, my land. Oh, it's produced. I better build a barn. I'm going to build a huge barn. And then my soul's required of me that night. And the creator of the universe calls me a fool. So he gave the baskets away. He didn't hold on to them. And that was a job. That was a handicraft. Saint Macarius the Great is a saint, a desert father. So what we do is a container. What will we put in it? Will we have to put anything in it? Do we keep the container? Questions. And the next one, three saints came to mind. I've been reading these two people. Saint Isaac the Syrian, he talked about the Garden of Eden and gave a commentary on the temptation. And he holds up the temptation, not from the twerp, the evil one that tempted Eve, but the Lord allowing this temptation to take place as a sign of how important the dignity of mankind is, and the freedom of mankind as the image of God is. And that likeness to the freedom of the dignity of God, well, it has to be, does it not follow that it has to be chosen? Now, granted, I would say Adam was in a Hegelian way of recounting history, or a way of embodying history, in the sense that Adam already was free. He was in freedom. The dignity of his freedom was presupposed. He was already there. He had named all the creatures. I mean, he's Adam. But the testing, without the negative overtone, that little interval, it doesn't have to be long. St. Isaac the Syrian talks about this. Their temptation, their test, rip away all the Protestant moves about predestination, all this stuff, rip away all that. If you just look at it, it's similar to the cookie in the cookie jar. I mean, it's such a simple thing. The choice was not this Sisyphean heroic thing that was asked of Adam. And that's not to downplay Adam, even though one could. It's to say that I don't buy the statement that we have to be these archetypes of romantic heroes pushing these huge boulders up for God. I think we have to check our propaganda of what it means to carry our cross. Now, again, I'm not trying to say too much. I'm going back to St. Isaac the Syrian. That temptation was to test the dignity of their freedom. It was for their good. But now if we zero into that situation, I think we find something that stresses and curbs interest. Adam's given a garden, prelapsarian. This is all before the fall. Given a garden, given this intelligence to name the animals, given the companion, Eve, life and earth brought together. But in addition to all that interest, all that good thing, very good, God said, very good. He said there was, it is, very good. In addition to that, we have the command of all the trees you may eat, except this one. That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the day you eat of it, you surely shall die. Death is not good. I think too, with asceticism, with fasting, with things in the tradition of the church, not outside the tradition of the church, in the tradition of the church, we find our interests curbed by design. Why can't I just go to law school or go backpack in Europe and make the sign of the cross and just keep everyone at bay and pile up my experiences in the barn of my memory? Well, the church comes along and says, you are free and you have dignity. You're in the image of God. Acquire the likeness, assimilate the grace of your baptism. Here are things. You want to prepare for communion, don't you? You can't do that if you're on top of the mountain hiding from everything and everyone. You eventually have to find a parish, which means you have to go somewhere that your interest doesn't incline you to.
Yeah. Not
because the interest is bad, but because there's more to life than our interest. There's God. God's as infinite is so beyond our possible interests. It's a miracle that we get to commune with something so beyond our interest. It's wonderful. But we won't know that until we know that. And so this struggle ensues. Okay, and then the third thing was Saint Maximus the Confessor. Somewhere he talks about circumscription. And he's talking about the senses. So your eye sees something, it's delightful. Your ear hears something, it's sonorous. Your feet go somewhere and you have this sense of walking. And all of these things are fine and good. But if we're not careful, we fall into the sequence of being conscripted by them or circumscribed by them. So I am what I see. Everything is that I see that matters for me, and I am in that seeing. So things I don't see, I'm afraid of them because what I can't see must be bad for me. Otherwise, I would see it. Who knows what it is? It's everything. Well, he says we're supposed to, in our soul, be outside our eye, soaring with the angels, which makes little things like, oh, he who lusts after a woman in his heart has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Oh, that starts to make sense because my world is not what I see. And in fact, if I reduce myself to taking pure pleasure in what I see, then I'm betraying my soul. So we can allow that sequence to circumscribe our discernment, making our discernment very small, which makes our interest very small, which makes us very small. But if we struggle ascetically to uncircumscribe out of our eyes, out of our ears, without destroying them, Arius is a heretic and he castrated himself. He's a heretic. We're not supposed to destroy ourselves. Body is good, creation is good. But the art, to go back to the beginning of how you use the word art, is to be able to see and see with faith. And I'm sorry, I can't do that alone. We need the community. the ecclesia, the church, the tradition, the saints. We need their prayers. We need guardian angels. We need help. We need, I'm the leper that says, I am, truly. Master, save us. And he does. We know this because he incarnated. But that idea of the dignity of following an order and the freedom of giving thanks, allowing us to get out of our conventional bodily senses, not to destroy them and repudiate them, but to have them and go beyond them without the pretension of thinking we are somewhere that we are not, which is the great temptation of temptation, and that is pride. Thinking I see something with faith that I do not see, right? I think that's one of the reasons faith is wed to humility in the tradition. What's your opinion?
Excellent. You said incredible amount. I very much enjoy what you had to say. It's very interesting because there's something about concluding that destroys freedom. If I conclude, I'm not free anymore. There's also something about sight that takes about freedom, because if everything is just what I see, I'm not free because there's just the room. So there's something about faith that keeps you insight free. And there's something about faith that keeps you in conclusion free, because the conclusion never concludes. So there's something about discernment that, as you're talking, it's interesting to me. There's something about discernment that keeps you free, because it keeps you from concluding. Like you're also talking about sight, where sight, again, there's a way in which what you see means you're not free, because there's a bookcase and there's nothing I can do about it. But if that's somehow participating in the mystery of the cosmos, there's a freedom now, because my relation to it is not reducible simply to the sight. And so there's a way in which, in this idea that there's something about the dignity of freedom that's really important to God. Well, everything is after our freedom, and yet we tend to actually think we're free in conclusion. Like you mentioned interest, you're actually not free in your interest, because now you have to follow your interest. There's something about interest that takes away freedom. There's something about thought that takes away freedom if you're not careful, because it concludes. What is a conclusion? It shuts you. It shuts down. There's something about sight that concludes, because there's a bookcase. It shuts down. There's nothing more. So there's something about the way that we naturally think, or naturally without faith, that has a concluding element to it. It concludes. Well, conclusion restricts freedom. It takes away freedom. God does not conclude. God does not conclude. He does not end, right? And so there has to be something about the human being that is avoiding conclusion in a closing way to participate in the image and likeness of God, or to have that reflected in their life and in what they're doing. And if we're not doing that, there's some sort of danger that is lurking here. There's also, so it's very interesting as well. The basket is a very interesting idea, because yeah, there's a sequence of making a basket, but from the sequence, you can never figure out what's going to be in the basket. Like all you can do is create the container, but what's going to be in the basket is not something that can be derived from the sequence of making the basket. And so there's something about thought that has to be like that. It's like, yes, I am thinking, but I'm never thinking. I can never conclude what's going to be in the basket. Like the basket denies a conclusion. It can complete, but it cannot conclude. So there's distinctions here. There's a way where you can complete the sequence, but you can't conclude what the sequence will lead to.
One quick addendum to that. That's what one quick addendum to that. That's what a festival is. A celebration is a basket that completes without concluding. And that's why you can put celebrations and festivals, feasts, you can put those in a calendar that repeats, because it is not the very nature of a festival. A celebration is a completing, not a concluding. What would an example of a concluding be? Well, one that comes to mind is death, mortality.
Yes.
And that is not what God made or intended for us. But in keeping a festival, there is completing. Completing of what? The harvest, rounding out a season, remembering the life of a saint, which is the defeat of death, among other things. A harvest. Okay.
No, I think that's exactly right. And discernment seems to, we've made a huge mistake to conflate conclude and complete. because it seems like discernment is about completing, not concluding, which then you can be complete and never can complete. You can complete the dance, like you're completing the skill of dance, you're completing the art, and theoretically it never concludes. You can have completion without conclusion. But we've kind of, because we're in finite time, we're trained into habits of sequence, we conflate those very naturally. But actually, the truth is, you can have conclusion and not have completion. You can have completion and not have conclusion, because you can be complete in God for eternity. Well, eternity doesn't what? Conclude. It's complete, but it doesn't conclude. And so there's something about discernment. And then, of course, that may kind of point to why we can't identify discernment, because that would complete it. When that would betray, that would conclude it, when that would betray the spirit of it, which is in the character of completing. So you can't conclude what discernment is. You can only find completion in it and through it and by the continual activity of it. So discernment seems to be, discernment and duration are on the side of completion without conclusion, which is why they have this weird character of mystery where you know it when you see it, but you can't finalize it. Well, of course you can't finalize it, because if you could, it wouldn't be a festival. And so what seems to be occurring is that the gaining of discernment is the ability to tell when something is participating to completion that isn't conclusion. But then, of course, you can't stop that to say what it is, because now you would have concluded the process. The moment you stop to say what it is, you've concluded. So you can't. So you have to keep going.
This is one of the reasons why I would say, as a gloss on the Ecclesiasticus, the wise man said, Solomon, the writing of many books is wearying to the body. From your distinction of completion and conclusion, when you write a book, think of that technology. You have concluded something, and you have what? Relegated the operation of your hand, your foot, your eye, your ear, and your lips. You've transferred all of those potential energies into an inert, paged thing that is done with. And you do that a number of times. All of those times are filled baskets that have kept you away from the dance of festival, where you would have moved, smelled the incense, said words, and gave your body as a book.
Yeah.
And I think this is important, though, with the printing press and movable type, the transmission of information. You can see it in odd ways, especially when in study habits. A person takes a marker and all they do is highlight what they read. All they do is underline what they read. Nothing in the margin is struck. Nothing is written down. I would call that a passive reading habit, because what are you doing? You're allowing your body to be drained and the book to become more and more important. Because nothing should change those words. I'm just going to highlight them. In other words, to repeat the sequence with a different color. It might as well have been scanned by a computer. But if you write next to it, if you engage with it, if you bring your mind to it, as you would at a festival, bring your feet and your hands and your nose to smell the incense burning, then you would not have given up your body to be wearied by the growing of the book.
That was exactly, well, it makes me think, well, I think that's exactly right with books. It's interesting because, as we've said, so we talked about meta and mystery. The problem is meta is a kind of simulation, a fake of mystery. But the reason, mystery has completeness, but not conclusion. Like, you're complete in the mystery, but it never concludes. The problem with the meta is it's never, never is complete nor concludes. It's like it goes on, but actually it's complete in its lack of conclusion, because you can always do another meta, right? So that's kind of like, there's this weird, the total depravity form of it is this completion and the never, it's concluding every time. It's always concluding into the next, and you can always meta and meta. I think also what we were saying on relationships, like it seems like relationships is the only way to have completion without conclusion, because you can never reduce a relationship to sequence. It is always a kind of birthplace of duration and surprise, precisely because of the consistency of the relationship. So in the same way too, there is something like, because you were saying, because they're like, why do we need others for faith? Well, there's something about, like, it's very much like impossible seemingly for an individual to not end up in a place of conclusion. You basically, like, it just, you know, you end up eventually saying, well, I've got the job, well, I've got the money, I've got my worldview, I've got my stuff. Like, you almost, it seemingly is impossible to, I would have to think of this, but this might be true. Can an individual alone avoid conclusion and have completion? That does not seem possible. It does not seem possible alone to have completion without conclusion. Like, you're going to fall into conclusion because you're going to die, and it's not going to have anyone for your spirit to live on through. And in the sense of, you're going to be, like, the very act of being alone means you've concluded that you have all you need, right? There has to be something conclusive in the lack of community. I mean, there's also just the fact that you have conversations,
well said, Daniel.
So there's
in the lack of community. Well said.
Yeah, and it's also just in the quality of community. Like, when you talk with someone, you have what? Ideas you never had before. Stuff comes up you never thought about. Ah, wow, you're complete, and yet you're not concluding. Like, you're fighting the tyranny of sight to, like, finish everything, right?
Yeah.
And so there's something about the conversation that is a complete, that I'm complete in the conversation. There's nowhere else you rather be. You feel the completion in a festival, in a good conversation, and yet the character of a good conversation is the exact opposite of conclusions, because stuff comes up you never thought about that then you have to rethink everything according to. So you see in the festival, in the community, in the conversation, where completeness is precisely a place that upends your conclusions, that opens new doors, that makes you have new apprehensions, that doesn't make you then not go outside. Now you're racing outside because now you understand the difference between mystery and meta. Like, the characteristics of ideas that lend themselves in the direction of completion is now it's go and see. Like, the tomb is empty, they're running out. So there's something also about discernment that then excites you to go into the world, to live. Whereas there's something about, say, sequence and conclusion that says, what's the point? I've concluded everything. I know everything. So it seems to be discernment also has the ability to identify these things of which lend themselves in the direction of completion without concluding, that then have the characteristic of a certain motivation to then make you participate in life in a different quality, in a higher way, in a more festive way, in a more intrinsically motivated way, in a way that is more in accordance with duration and mystery. And discernment then is an identification of that. This awareness of this, and it also then speaks to, like, and then I'll give it back to you. It's like what you see in here, like, often, there's this idea of objects of desire in Lacan and psychoanalysis, and how they always get you into trouble. Like, you shouldn't have objects of desire. Well, is what we're seeing here is there's something about the problem with objects is they're concluding. I have the object or I do not. Desire is meant to seek completeness, participate like Eros does with Dante and Beatrice. It's drawing you into the mystery. It's drawing you into the place of completion without conclusion, which means that you're looking for the completeness of desire, not the conclusion of desire. The irony about objects of desire is that they desire too little in a funny way. They conclude, they finish themselves off. Like, desire as love, as rightly ordered Eros, is actually to kind of desire and be moved toward the love that moves the sun and other stars, right? It's to be moved into the place of community. Well, this makes sense because a community is what? A place of love. A community is a place of desire, but not lust. It's a place of this rightly ordered love. And what you're desiring is, your desire is, like Augustine says famously, right? Your heart is restless until we find, it finds itself in you. Well, there's something about completeness is that place where you feel that kind of Sabbath rest, that is participating in the image and likeness of God, precisely because it is in a humility to that. Because there's also something, because you were talking about humility there at the end, humility is an inherent characteristic of a completion that realizes it cannot conclude because it has to be open. Like to leave things open is to be humble. To close them off means I don't need anything else. Like if you conclude, you're saying you have all you need. When if you're open, you're saying I don't have all I need. And in fact, that realization I don't have all I need is precisely where I can find completion in relation, which is inherently an acknowledgement of the other. So there's something about the conclusion that must be prideful. You know, pride has to have this cutting off characteristic. And so there's the, like, what you're doing is saying, I've concluded. Well, you've said you've made the universe then. Like you've gotten the universe. There's something about conclusion that's like creation's over. You know, I get it now. There's no more creating. There's no more possibility of duration. The sequence is over. And so there's something about discernment is the recognition, and then I'll give it back to you, in terms of thought, desire, actions, routines. When these things are in service of completion and when these things are in service of conclusion. And discernment is the ability to tell that difference, which seems to metaphorically have a characteristic of an apathetic walking stick, and then to get better at identifying the completion that seems like it must have the completion that seems like it must have a communal element. It must have a festive element, because if it did not, then you must think you have your conclusion in of yourself. That's why you're alone. Like that, you know, that is why you're alone. There's some sort of, you've reached a conclusion. Maybe your conclusion is people will let me down, or I'm inadequate, or, you know, people are scary, or you can't trust people. It seems like the only reason you would not relate to people is because of some conclusion. You reach some conclusion, and that's why you don't relate to people. Now, I guess there's the possibility of being in the Amazon and not knowing about anybody like a feral child or someone. But that then kind of suggests a certain, like, it's not really conclusion there that leads you to that. It's a kind of ignorance, right? So I'm sure there's a different sort of cosmic standard there that we can talk about. But generally speaking, it seems like if you cut yourself off, it has to be due to conclusions of some character. Like you have reached conclusions that mean you should not be in relation. What else would keep you from relation but conclusions?
Wow, well said. Especially that last part of what precipitates the cutting off. Daniel, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and time together tonight. I have to go.
I do as well, actually, so it works out.
Yeah, but thank you so much on what you said and how you said it. The prodigal son comes to mind again. You and I have looked at that story from different angles. And one thing, I'll be brief as an observation, especially with the cutting off by conclusion and distance. Notice again, the prodigal says to his father, give me my share of the inheritance. He cuts himself off with substance. And he goes forth and he does things in a sequence, trying to make something of himself. The parable doesn't say why he goes, but he degrades slowly till he has nothing and he's between two pigs at a trough. The lowest place he could have found himself as the son of this father. And then he says, when he comes to himself, I think that's important. He comes to himself. Does he come to the crown? Does he come to the ring? Does he come to the slippers? Does he come to the robe? He comes to himself. And then he says, what? You know what? I've had the wrong categorical imperative. No, he says, how many of my father's servants are well fed? All of them. That's base. No, it's humble and simple. And as close to him as coming to himself is, what will I eat? Remember the trees? You may eat of all of them, except the one. So he comes to himself, and then what does he do? He says, I have a solution for my hunger. And it's an accusatory tone. Come on now, my father's servants are well taken care of. If I hire myself out, I'll eat. Humble. He's within himself. He's not, I'm going to go to France, I'm going to go to Spain, I'm blah, 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 blah. And he comes home. Compare that with the other son, who is at a distance, not as far, but maybe further. What do I mean? It says he's out in the field. Sequence B. Sequence A, you're going out to another village and you join yourself to another citizen. Sequence, you end up between two pigs. Well, he's just out in the field of his father working. Another sequence. So much of an interval of time. So many identifications. He comes back to the doorstep of his father's house and he won't go in, hearing the music. When he hears that it's his brother's in there, he won't address him as his brother. But what does he say to his father? I have served you these many years and you have not given me a goat to enjoy with my friends. So, step back from that parable, Jesus is speaking to the religious elite, the scribes and the Pharisees. We know who the prodigal is, the prostitutes, everyone who's not a scribe or a Pharisee. What happened to that second son, where coming to himself and being hungry or just looking for food, where that was no longer in the picture? And he no longer had to use that as he addressed his father. Why was for him that goat a future thing that he was interested in? Right? And now, oh man, when the interest was taken away, he couldn't conclude his interest. It was dead already. His father killed it and gave it to the other brother. What? That's my Messiah. I mean, that's really, his interest was concluded. And his father had nothing to be sorry for. And that was probably another dagger, right? He was expecting an apology from his father. His father had no reason to give an apology for. The goat wasn't spoken for. The fattened calf wasn't spoken for, but I suppose in the mind of that brother out in the field, it was spoken for. But the problem was that son never spoke up for it. Because what did the father say? All that is mine is yours. Why is it that we don't talk to God sometimes? We go on a long journey in a car and we go alone. It can be a long journey. But we all know this. We go on a journey with someone else in the passenger seat and we have a dialogue. The hours seem to go by like minutes. Why is that? What is this social logos, sociology doing here in the console? All right. Your final words, my friend, for this evening.
Well, I enjoyed it immensely, and I really like what you said on the older son, because I think like what's so critical is this means the older son never related with the father. And there's something about morality as like, I was moral, so I conclude that I ought to have gotten this goat, but he never completed the relationship. He never told, so there was conclusion, but not, and that's the risk of morality and law, right? I followed the law, therefore I should get conclusion. Like conclusion is what's at the end of a sequence. And so like this, what you see here is like, this should have happened to me, but he clearly never spoke to his dad. He never asked for it. So he never completed the relationship. He made conclusions based on his identification of himself as moral. So there's something where identification seems to go with conclusion. Discernment seems to go. So you have identification, sequence, and conclusion. These things seem to go together. And within those, which, because we're stuck in those things, fallen, sequence, etc., if you want to put it, there's this discernment, duration, and completion that seems fundamentally relational. Because relation is what completes without concluding. When you relate to someone, you never conclude them because that's called putting them in a box, objectification, not good. Like the completion of a relationship is fundamentally a mystery, and it speaks to a completion that does not conclude. I think so then it's also the thing that's also interesting to me as you were speaking is beauty, that experience of beauty, this experience of duration. And I think it's critical with the prodigal son, this thing, he comes to his senses or something emerges in him. It's not a sequence, it just happens. All of these bring a kind of authority. This is what's interesting. When you experience beauty, there's a kind of authority. It's like, that's beauty. Likewise, when you experience the surprise, there's a kind of authority in the surprise, in its vividness of reality. Likewise, in the duration, there's authority. Likewise, there's a kind of authority in that speeding up of time, of the flow state, of the kairos. There's this kind of authority that you experience it, and there's this like, this is reality, and I'm not really in a place to say this isn't real. Like, that's what you feel like. You're like, who am I to say that the flow is just subjective? Because it's not. Who do I think I am? Likewise, when you experience beauty, there's this kind of humbling, but in a kind of authority that fullest reality has. And I think that goes back to Genesis, because it starts with what? Authority. This seems to be like these things that you experience that bring with them a fundamental experience of authority have that characteristic of God's creative act. Authority, thus, it's not the very experience of these things is having a kind of authority suggests their participation in creation and the original creative act, which seems to be why they can create you anew in the experience of them, and then point to you on what you need to discern so that you can engage in the creative act throughout your life as you're going through sequence, so that you can create it into sublatively more duration than less, and you are now in experience the authority of the act itself. That then gives you reason to think that you ought to be bringing more duration into sequence, not because you, according to your taste, decided you like this, but because you experienced the authority of beauty, the authority of kairos and flow and duration, and under that authority, in accordance to that authority, in the name of the Father, you are then bringing that duration more so to sequence. And I think that is discerning that authority, and then participating in that authority, if you will, which is the authority in which creation comes from and is from in response to, then brings about a different quality of living that I hope on this day that we can all get better at and do more of. But we can only do it thanks to relation, because otherwise, if we're outside of relation, we have concluded as opposed to finding completion. Completion is found in the participation of the creative act in the name of that authority as possible in community and relationship. So thank you, my friend, for this conversation and this opportunity. I've enjoyed it, sir.
Till next time.
Till next time, my friend. All the best, Matthew. Thank you, sir.